Hey everyone, I am pro photographer Ian Plant, and everybody loves photographing sunrise and sunset. And what I'm talking about here is actually shooting into the sunrise or sunset sky. But it can be a lot more difficult than you think. And that's because at sunrise and sunset, there is a lot of contrast. There's a lot of range between light and dark in the scene, and that range is often very difficult for your digital camera sensor to handle. So in this video, I'm going to share 5 of my favorite techniques for taking stunning sunrise and sunset photos. Okay, in this video, I'm going to share my top 5 tips for taking stunning sunrise and sunset photos. But first, I'm going to lead off with an answer to a question that I often get. People actually ask me this question. They'll ask me, Ian, which is better, sunrise or sunset? Of course, the answer is neither. Now, an individual sunrise or sunset can be better than another sunrise or sunset, but there's really no qualitative difference between sunrise versus sunset. And obviously, sunrise and sunset are different. The sun is in a different position in the sky, so sunrise might work better for certain scenes, sunset might work better for other scenes, but other than that, there's no real difference between the two. I mean, one could make the argument that sunset is better because you can get out and explore the scene before sunset happens. So with sunrise, you've got to get up super early, and then you're stumbling around in the dark, trying to get to where you need to be and to figure the scene out before the sun rises. And at sunset, you've got a lot more time to get all that worked out. So in that regard, sunset might be easier to photograph. But what I love about sunrise is that there's typically no one else around because, most people are sleeping in. They're not crazy to get up to see the sunrise. And so when you're photographing sunrise, you can have the whole place to yourself. But personally, I just compromise. I don't really think you should have to pick one or the other. I shoot both. Tip number 1, choose the right lens. So your focal length choice is actually very important when you're photographing sunrise or sunset. So if it's a clear day, there's not much going on in the sky, you don't have any clouds catching the color, you've just got that big ball of the sun rising or setting. Shooting that with a wide-angle lens probably isn't the best option for most scenes because you'll have this big blank empty sky, and then you'll have the tiny ball of the sun. So on a clear day, typically I'm looking to use a longer focal length to make that sun really big, and more often than not, I'm looking for something interesting in the scene that I can put in front of the sun and shoot that interesting feature, maybe a bird in the distance or some sort of animal, or some interesting landmark feature or something like that. I pin that against the sun rising or setting in the background, and that can allow you to make really compelling photos at this time. So if you want to make that sun look really big, you're probably going to need a focal length of at least 400 millimeter full frame equivalent. 500 or 600 will make the sun look even bigger. So those really long focal lengths are necessary to magnify the sun. On the other hand, if you do have a lot of clouds in the sky and those clouds are catching color at sunrise and sunset, then you're probably going to go for a wider focal length. So if you've just got a few clouds clustered around the setting sun, for example, then you're probably not going to want to go as wide. You're going to want to go as wide enough to include all of those colorful clouds. But if you've got clouds covering the entire sky that just light up with color at sunrise or sunset, then you're going to want to go very wide to bring all of that beautiful color into your composition. And that leads me to tip number 2, pray for clouds. So let's be honest, clear skies are typically really boring for sunrise or sunset photography. Instead, you want some clouds in the sky to catch the light of the rising or setting sun. Typically, partly cloudy to mostly cloudy skies are best for really effective sunrise and sunset photography. Too many clouds are going to block the sun, and you're not going to get any lighter color. So you want clouds with gaps in them. You want textured clouds, because that's where you're going to get that really great light and color on the clouds. Ideally, you want the sky full of these textured clouds, and then you want just a small gap on the horizon where the sun is rising or setting. And if you're lucky, then the whole sky will light up with color. Now, it's hard to predict when this is going to happen. I usually check the weather forecast, and I'm looking for partly to mostly cloudy skies. And usually the best chances of getting a really stunning sunrise or a sunset are when there is a weather front moving through the area where you're photographing. And so if the edge of that front is at sunrise or sunset, that is when you might get that breakthrough of light that paints the entire sky with color. So that's what I'm really hoping for, is some sort of dramatic weather event moving in at the very right time so I can make those really stunning sunrise and sunset photos. Tip number 3, use reflections. So whenever I'm photographing a sunrise or a sunset and I'm near water, I start thinking about incorporating reflections into my photos. These are going to take your sunrise and sunset photos to the next level. And this is easy to do when you're working near water, such as on the ocean, on a lake, or even small streams and ponds. In areas where you're not near water, you can also look for rainwater pools, or even wet surfaces just after a rainstorm before the landscape dries up. Ideally, you'll want calm water so that you can get a mirror-like reflection, but even moving water can bring in lots of extra color. Tip number 4, bracket your exposures. So when you are photographing at sunrise and sunset, you are typically pointing your camera at the very brightest part of the scene. And this is going to mean that there's a lot of contrast, and that contrast might exceed the dynamic range of your camera sensor, which is the ability to simultaneously capture detail in highlights and shadows. And so in those circumstances, it's typically a good idea to auto bracket your exposures. Do like a +2, -2 auto bracket. So you have a really bright exposure that captures a lot of detail in the shadows. You've got a middle exposure, and then you've got a dark exposure that preserves detail in the highlights. So you want to be very careful to have at least one exposure where none of the highlights are overexposed. But be aware that it may be impossible to do this if you actually have the sun in your composition. So if you can see the sun, because it is so very, very bright relative to everything in the scene, it might be difficult or impossible to avoid some overexposure in the sun. Now, when the sun is high in the sky, it tends to be brighter and it makes it more difficult to capture detail in the sun. When the sun gets really low near the horizon, there might be a lot of atmospheric haze that will block the intensity of the light. And in those circumstances, it's easier to get an exposure of the sun where you actually have detail in the sun. So even when you can't actually preserve detail in the sun, you want to make sure that you preserve as much detail as possible in the highlights in the sky around the sun. So try your very best to have at least one exposure where most of the sky has detail. You're not overexposing the highlights there, even if you can't completely control the highlights in the sun itself. So I said before that for most scenes, a +2, -2 automatic bracket will be enough. For some scenes with a lot more contrast, you may need to extend that bracketing. So maybe a +3, -3, or a +5, -5, depending on how much contrast there is in the scene. In any event, just make sure you preserve as much detail as possible in the highlights and in the shadows in your exposure bracket. And then on the computer, you can bring those exposures together into a single file. For example, with Adobe Lightroom or Camera Raw, you can use the Merge to HDR feature to blend those exposures together and have a merged file that preserves detail in both highlights and shadows. And finally, tip number 5, make your photos about more than just the sunrise or sunset. If you just point your lens at the sunrise or sunset sky, you're going to end up with a lot of really boring pictures. You'll have a lot of pretty color, but you're not really making photos of anything in particular. You're just photographing the sunrise or the sunset. And I don't think that these photos are going to be very effective. So instead, you want to incorporate other visual elements within the sunrise or sunset scene. So you're making the photo about more than just the sunrise or sunset itself. You're making a complete composition that just happens to feature that beautiful sunset or sunrise sky. So the sky has to be part of the photo, but your composition should include lots of other stuff as well. So I'm always looking for other interesting visual elements to include as I build my overall visual design. So I talked about reflections earlier. They're definitely a possibility, but usually I'm looking for interesting landscape features or wildlife to include in my photos. If you can incorporate these other design elements, you're going to take your sunrise and sunset photos to the next level. Well, that's it for now. I hope you found this video helpful, and make sure to check out all of the amazing free and premium photo education resources available to you over on PhotoMasters. I'm Ian Plant, wishing you good luck and even better light. See you guys next time. Bye-bye.